This morning, our scripture reading is found in Paul's letter to the Roman church, Romans chapter 8, and we're starting in verse 12. So then, brothers and sisters, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. If, in fact, we suffer with him so that we may also be glorified with him. I consider that all the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait with patience. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Among the more hopeful stories I've seen lately on the internet have been ones of families completing the adoption process and making official what has been true in their hearts for a long time. Often these stories include an adorable photo of a child or children with big grin, all dressed up in their best for this important court date, and holding a sign that says something like 1,472 days in foster care. And finally, I have found my forever family. It's hard for some of us to imagine the kind of persistent hope required of these children and their parents as they first have to find one another and then wait as the legal and bureaucratic process is completed. And I'm sure that there are some of you here this morning who know exactly the frustrations and the joys of adopting a child or of being adopted yourself and of finding your forever family. In ancient Roman society, children, especially heirs, for anyone of means, were highly valued. However, some children, particularly of the poor and the desperate, would be abandoned or sold into slavery with common regularity. The lucky ones, of course, were adopted by wealthy, childless couples and would enjoy all the rights and privileges of natural-born children as full and legal heirs of that family. And so for our text today, Paul uses this common image of adoption to help explain the believer's new identity in light of what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. Paul assures the church in Rome that when they take on the Spirit of God, they are not abandoned or kept in slavery to sin and death, but they are indeed adopted into God's great family. The idea of being able to claim the identity of a son or daughter of God was pretty radical in both the Jewish and the Roman worldview. For the Jews, it was Israel, God's chosen people, who were called the firstborn of God. And then, of course, we cannot forget that Son of God was among Caesar's many titles. So for those in the new church, to be able to claim such an identity was powerful. And even now, we must never forget that adoption is an act of grace. And the inheritance of glory and life eternal with God in Christ is one that is freely given by God. As heirs, we do not work for or earn this inheritance. It is simply part of our very identity. But with this great gift comes responsibilities and a warning from Paul. As co-heirs with Christ, we not only share in his glory, but also in his suffering. The suffering we experience now, Paul tells us, it's not even worth comparing to the future glory we will receive. But that still does not mean that we are immune to the suffering of this world. Some of you all may know that in our Rhino Camp program, we include some time for worship and discussion and other activities that help the youth connect what they are seeing and experiencing here on their mission trip in New Orleans with their faith, and helping them take home these lessons that they have learned. And one of the images that we use to help describe the city of New Orleans and all of its contradictions is that of a jazz funeral and a second-line parade. In the traditional jazz funeral, many of you all know that you have the front line with the deceased and those closest to them, mourning and oftentimes visibly and audibly displaying their grief. And then you have the second line with the brass band and the rest of the funeral procession of family and friends parading around the neighborhood to bury their loved ones. The songs that accompany the dead to their final resting place range from a slowed-down version of Just a Closer Walk with Thee to the almost festival-like Oh, When the Saints Go Marching In. And then you have those in the second line who are dancing and singing along. And so in a jazz funeral, you have deep and profound grief and celebration and joy right there next to each other, interwoven with each other on display. And we share with the Rhino groups that New Orleans is a lot like this. You can see here great tragedy and suffering, but also celebration, triumph, resilience, and joy. I think that one of the things our scripture is telling us is that you don't have to live in New Orleans to understand this reality. Even children of God who have great hope and joy in the love and grace of God still experience pain and suffering. One of the reasons we suffer is because we still live in the realm of sin, or of the flesh, as Paul puts it, which is not to say that our human embodied lives are inherently evil. Far from it. For in fact, God does redeem even our bodies. But it speaks to the world order of the flesh, in which selfish desires, violence, betrayal, destruction, and death reign, not the life-giving Spirit of God. Not only are we still influenced by sin's presence in our lives, but our suffering is compounded by the fact that we have tasted the first fruits of the Spirit. And we now know that there is something better out there. We already know the power of Christ's victory over sin and death, and the freedom we have in that power. We already know of God's unfailing love and boundless grace. It is like we have been invited to a fancy dinner party. We know that the food is going to be Michelin star quality. Imagine Emeril Lagasse or whoever your favorite chef is. They're in the kitchen cooking up their finest. And the first course comes out, and it is the best food you've ever tasted. And you want more. You now know what good food should taste like. Food that is in season, local, and fresh, and cooked and seasoned perfectly. When we ourselves suffer, or when we see the suffering of the world all around us, we get frustrated and angry and sad, and we groan with all of creation because we know things are not as they should be. We know that things can and should be better. And suffering is not evidence of God's abandonment or separation, but rather it is a sign of living in the conflict zone between this present time and the age to come. And so our suffering is not without hope. The groans we utter are not groans of resignation, but groans of resolution and resilience. It is this hope that keeps us from despair and keeps us going despite the obstacles and gives us the strength in the face of adversity. Our identity as heirs informs us in times of suffering that the way things are not the way they should be or will be in the end. Our identity as God's children also gives us the responsibility to join in the work of hope that God is already doing all around us. God invites us not only into the family, but into the family business. And we are to give hope where it is needed the most and to take care of each other, just as God takes care of us. I will leave you this morning with this story. On Thursday night, shortly after I arrived at the hospital, a nurse took me, Caroline, and Kathleen, who is the pastor at First Pres Wahoo, back to the trauma bays where they were working on each of the injured. To say it was chaotic is an understatement. We were being pulled in about 20 different directions, just trying to locate each kid and Cliff. And we just wanted to see with our own eyes that everyone was okay, and to see them talking and to hold their hands as the doctors were working on them. Just do whatever was needed. And as one of the nurses was showing me around and we were walking, I was trying to explain to her who we all were, trying to get in her good graces so she would allow us access. And I, was telling her that I'm a pastor, Kathleen's a pastor, and we're, all from a church group. And she stopped walking and turned back and took a step towards me and said, "Thank God you're here. I can always tell who the spiritual people are. There's just something different about them. Your presence here makes a difference, and I'll be praying for you all." It was one of those strange moments in that night that I think will forever remain in my memory. And as I reflect on it now, I think that presence she was talking about is the Spirit of God within us. This Spirit allows us to walk in the midst of suffering and gives us the strength to hope, even when everything is chaotic and frightening and not as it should be. It is this same Spirit which allows us to cry to God, "Abba, Father," and the same Spirit which answers back, "Yes, my child, I'm here."